So, Kieran Rose, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I am good. I'm enjoying your panda and giraffe sitting next to each other in the background.
They're having a chat from across continents.
Yeah, my Yoda's somewhere down there, all by himself.
Yeah.
So, we were going to talk today about, about the autistic experience and sensory integration and processing differences.
Mhm.
Which of course you and I have talked about a lot. They persist throughout the lifespan. They don't just magically go away. They're a real thing. Um, but one of the things that I know the autistic population often experiences is a sort of, I think first of all, there's a lack of permission to um, feel things differently, like just in the first place, isn't there? And we released an infographic about that last week or so. But, just that there's this sort of unwritten rule in our society that expressing comfort at other people's, at the expense of other people's comfort isn't okay, which is a very negative cycle. So thinking about the autistic experience, particularly, what thoughts does that spark in you?
It makes me think about a really big word, which is alexithymia.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, alexithymia, think about interoception. Interoception is the messages that get passed around inside our bodies. And that's connected to our emotional states as well, because our sensory states and our emotional states are so closely interlocked, that one influences the other. And emotions are a sensory experience as well. We sense our emotions, we feel our emotions. So alexithymia is kind of the interoception, but of the emotional world. And it is a disconnect between our cognitive conscious brains and our emotional states, so that we don't recognize kind of how we're feeling in the moment, and we don't also recognize for our interoception now the messages that our bodies are giving us to tell us that we're feeling certain things and stuff. So I don't know, for example, with anxiety, the traditional notion is butterflies in the tummy, or a fast beating heart and things like that. We might not make the connection between what's going on in our bodies and what's going on in our emotional
Mm.
states. When from a really early age, we're not allowed to respond to sensory information in the way that we need to, or we express certain feelings about certain sensory information, that maybe something is painful that other people might not recognize as being painful, or that
No,
something
it's not. You're
feels good.
fine.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that kind of, and it's not usually not a kind of a nasty thing that someone's
Right.
gone out of their way to make you feel bad about what you're saying, or actively disbelieving you. It's more of a sense of, well, this is my normative experience, so that must also be your normative experience. And when it's not a normative experience and it is undermined kind of unwittingly,
Even
constantly,
well-meaningly, yeah.
yeah, even well-meaningly, constantly over the course of your development, well, then you kind of teach yourself not to listen to what your body's telling you. And you kind of teach yourself, well, I can't be responding to stuff that can't hurt me because everybody's telling me it can't be hurting me. So there must be something going wrong with me. There's something wrong with me, as and then that narrative builds and builds and builds and builds. And it ends up where we have this state of being where we don't know what's going within our own bodies, that we don't recognize when things are harmful to us from a sensory perspective. We don't actively seek out the things that we enjoy anymore, or we do it really discreetly and hide it and redirect it into ways that don't regulate us well enough and help our brains and bodies work in the way that they need to, that bring
Mm.
us joy, or that help us to avoid harm and stuff. So there's this whole narrative of other people's opinions about how autistic brains and bodies should be responding to the world, which aren't anything to do with the reality of how our brains and bodies respond to the world.
Yeah.
And that little thing that you said there right at the beginning sparked off that whole line of thinking for me about
Yeah.
how that invalidation teaches us to invalidate ourselves as well.
But I would say it's even deeper than that, right? Because it's like the invalidation sort of usurps you ever learning to listen to your body.
Hmm.
And so there is a sort of implicit message about being broken, and none of it's that conscious or cognitive until you do a lot of work later in life. And so your belief system really becomes your sense of self. It is very it becomes about appearances rather than experiences. So you're never really grounded because you're never connected, but you have to appear that way all the time. And so it's almost, when we're not just being sort of taught that our own body signals are unreliable in that cognitive way. It's like deeply embedded in our
unconscious.
self-concept.
Yeah. And that the influence that has on our developing identities, and that it gets to the point for many of us who reach adulthood and haven't recognized that we're autistic, and suddenly find out in some way, or learn over time that this might be our narrative. And then there becomes, and this is leaning into the kind of masking narrative as well, that there becomes a point where actually, hold on a minute, this is now my new narrative. I don't know who I am because I'm not connected in any way, shape, or form other than through that kind of unconscious performative way of where I've been meeting other people's needs and expectations all the time. And you don't know who you are. And there's that lack of identity.
Sort of template is being invisible and people pleasing. There's not any like self-determination and self-actualization. And so what happens when you age out of therapies and things like that, and being invisible and people pleasing aren't quite so important anymore, maybe, or you just can't successfully manage them as an adult because there's much less grace for your differences as an adult. That I think what to me, what we're talking about here is something that might sound a bit abstract to people, but is of such fundamental importance to human development and well-being. And I'm thinking about the person in the workplace who therefore isn't able to identify what temperature works well for them or what lighting works well for them, but gets persistently agitated with what the environment, how the environment is designed, and wouldn't even necessarily stop to think, maybe my body can tell me what's wrong, but just, I don't feel safe here. That's my baseline. I just think about all the ways that it derails a person's functioning, really.
Yeah, and I see it from the perspective of looking at it from the perspective of someone who's non-speaking, who isn't supported to adequately communicate in a way that works for them, and therefore it's not even necessarily a dismissal of their sensory needs and their sensory responses. No one even knows what they are because no one's ever gone out of their way to find out or ask in a way that works for that person. And it's that level of kind of ignorance, and I don't mean that in a deliberately ignorant kind of way. I mean ignorance in the terms of not knowing what's going on, is so commonplace for non-speakers and speaking autistic people. But I think there's a similar, if not worse, level of harm for non-speakers who are then unable to advocate for themselves in any kind of way. And it's coming to masking again. There's this assumption that non-speaking people can't mask, which is completely wrong, because even non-speakers can project that acceptability and meet other people's needs in certain ways. And and it's just such a complicated thing. And what it all is underpinned by is this normative expectation that my experiences are the same as other people's experiences when it comes to sensory information. And it's interesting as well, something I was thinking about the other day, that not when I say we, I mean the generalized we, as in the we in the world. We never talk about sensory experiences unless it's in relation to autistic people. We very rarely talk about the sensory world around non-autistic people. Non-autistic people don't even really talk about sensory stuff. and aren't actually probably as connected to their sensory worlds as maybe they think they are as well. And there's a whole level of conversation that needs to be going on around how much of this is human experience,
Yeah.
and how there's so much different human need, but the group that don't even think and consider themselves as sensory creatures, because it never enters their head to do that, assume that everybody else experiences the world the way that they do, and
Yeah.
assumes then that responses that don't look like their responses are somehow wrong, or somehow examples of deficits, or so on and so on. It's a fascinating thing to me that
Yeah.
people can exist like that without considering that other people exist differently.
Yeah, I mean, there's layers and layers and layers to unpack about this,
Oh,
and I think you've touched on some very kind of systemic, you know, ableist medical model kind of baked in assumptions of our culture. But I want to, there's a few things I want to rewind to. So first of all, just explain, just in case people watching haven't heard this phrase before, what is masking in 10 seconds?
in 10 seconds. Okay. Masking is a human behavior that everybody engages in on one level. So we have things like context switching, where we act a little bit differently in different situations and around different people. So if we were in a bar together, we might act a little bit differently around the people that we're with than if we were at work, or so on. But masking from a marginalized perspective becomes next level. So all marginalized groups, there's evidence that all marginalized group mask. The LGBTQA plus community have the closet. The Black communities talk about passing. The autistic community talk about masking. So this is about fundamentally, developmentally responding to the needs of other people who effectively invalidate you over the course of your life. So it stems from stigma, and it stems from being othered and marginalized in various different ways. And what it means is changing yourself in particular ways in order to make you more acceptable from another person's perspective. So that might be suppressing yourself in certain ways. It might be suppressing your sensory responses, for example, particularly things around pain responses and stuff like that. It might be changing the way that you communicate, or trying to change the way that you communicate, changing things like your body position and the way that you hold yourself and the way that you move, changing your behavior. There's been a narrative for a long time that masking is about fitting in and appearing more neurotypical. But actually, I kind of like to pluck that, rip that narrative apart a little bit, because the assumption that we want to be neurotypical and that also we're controlling what's going on are two things that undermine that. So I talk about autistic people who mask through challenging behavior, autistic people who mask through being people pleasers and fawners, who mask through being the class clown and stuff like that. So it's about projecting whatever social behavior is expected of you, or whatever niche that you've managed to fit yourself into that makes you less stigmatized in certain ways. So it's a really complicated thing to explain in a very short space of time, which is why I can talk about it for hours.
To a certain extent, everyone does some kind of masking.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, it's an adaptive, self-protective behavior.
Yeah.
But when it's chronic and it's at your own expense and the expense of your wellness and energy and so on, and that's why one thing that we think about maybe why autistic burnout happens, then it's maladaptive, and then it's something that we want to sort of address intentionally.
Absolutely.
Not just like pull it away and say no one should
No.
do
And it's there. Again, there's another narrative about, how do I stop masking? And this is something that autistic people have been curating and developing over the course of their lives, however long their lives might be. So it's not something you can just suddenly stop doing. But mitigating it looks like taking more control, more self-understanding, and enabling authenticity within yourself in really safe ways. Some people, white men particularly, might have more control over that than other people who are more marginalized in other ways. So people of different skin colors and things who, experience different levels of marginalization and different intersections of marginalization are going to find that more difficult. So it's going to look different for every single person, dependent on their situations as well.
Yeah. And then another thing that you said, you talked about suppressing responses to things, sensory responses. I think you said that word,
I did, yeah.
something along those lines. And I also thought about, one aspect of the sensory integration process, sort of towards the end, if it was a linear process, which spoiler it isn't, but anyway, is your motor outputs, right?
Mm.
It's the action response that your
Yeah,
body produces, and those are suppressed as well for autistic people. That to me is glaring, that like stereotypies and I can't remember what else, sort of stims and these other behaviors are conditioned out of people
yeah, yeah. There
somewhere around
is,
the elementary school age.
yeah, earlier sometimes, and
Yeah.
it's there's a level of usually unintentional pathologization that happens for autistic people on pretty much every level of who they are. So if you think about your common and garden traditional stereotypical autistic person, not that that person exists, but if we imagine that there was such a
Your
person that
common
matched that
garden
diagnostic
autist.
criteria and was the perfect autistic in terms of the narrative that we currently exist under, so they are pathologized through how they think, how they feel, how they communicate, how they move, how they sleep, how they eat, and it just goes on and on and on and on every single level, because they're othered, because they're stigmatized, because they're marginalized. Even if you know that person is autistic or you don't know that person is autistic, what they're expressing to you through their autisticness is not quite right for a non-autistic person. And we live in a world which has normalized non-autisticness. So that developmental kind of level around the kind of everything you do, and stimming is a great example of that. So, and again, that brings us back to the assumptions that there are certain autistic people who can mask and certain people who can't. Some people stim furiously and openly, no matter how they've been pathologized. Their stimming will continue to be very obvious and very open. That doesn't mean that they don't utilize their mask in some other way,
Sure.
because it's a movable feast. It changes, it expands, it contracts, and it depends again on the needs of and expectations of other people. So all those things are kind of happening in different ways for different people, which is why the importance of individualizing everything and recognizing that autistic people are not a huge homogenous group who exist in exactly the same way, that we're all
Right.
unique individuals. I know, like newsflash headlines.
Yeah.
We're individual people who do things differently, like every other human on the planet. So just that recognition is also lacking, and those myths around the homogeny of autistic people and all the other myths out there, the gazillion that we could probably talk about for weeks and weeks and weeks, all feed into that identity development, that
And the message that
pathologization, and
you're not quite right.
you're not quite right, you're not quite good enough, you're not fully completely a human being, you've got deficits, you're broken. All of those narratives feed
Yeah.
into all of that, and it usually starts around the sensory stuff. I talk about quite often, considering autistic babies, which we
Yeah.
never think about. Autistic babies, we never talk about autistic babies who are having sensory experiences and
Mm.
can only communicate those experiences through maybe laughter if they're developed enough, or smiling, or crying. And
Mm.
I talk about myself, who's someone who's very, very touch averse and feels pain when people put skin on skin. um, and as a baby, the only way I could have communicated that was through crying. And what do we do when babies cry? We touch them even more. We pick them up,
Mm.
cuddle them.
Mm.
That
Mm.
continued. So
Or what about the autistic baby who laughs but hasn't met the professional who's able to read the signs of distress in their
exactly,
physiology?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so that laugh is misinterpreted as
Mm-hmm.
do it again, because that, I mean, all humans laugh inappropriately at times,
Of
but
course,
nobody admits that.
no,
Um, and so when
no.
you're, the neurodivergent brain and body that kind of giggles when something's scary, or those sorts of pieces, like
Mm-hmm.
who's helping us have grace and understanding for that?
And there's also the narratives around things like motor apraxia as well, and you know that there are babies out there who will be giving physical responses that aren't the physical responses that they're meaning to give. So there's so many complicated sub levels to all of this, but all of it comes back to, and again, much of the invalidation is completely unwitting, but it comes into the fact that we don't think about the possibility of having disabled children. First of all, we're not prepared for that eventuality, which could happen to anybody. But certainly when things are really prevalent, being autistic, being ADHD, stuff like that, there's never a kind of, well, what if there's something different going on here from a baby perspective, unless it's really obvious and really exaggerated. But we should be thinking and normalizing
actually,
those
what
kind of
happens
things.
is that the mum gets told she's hysterical and she needs to
Yeah,
calm
she's a
down.
bad mother
Anxious
or
mum.
whatever. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're so right. I love how you're like, who thinks about babies? I'm like, me all the freaking time,
Well,
but that's not what you meant.
most people don't, but
Yeah. Um, okay. I mean, I'm listening to this and I always love talking to you, but I'm thinking that one of the things we really need to do very, very deliberately as um, healthcare providers, educators, caregivers, friends, humans, is like unlearn a lot of baked in um, assumptions doesn't even seem the right word,
no,
but
it's not deep
assumptions,
enough, is it?
beliefs. There's a whole way of thinking that we have stopped even noticing we do, but that deficit emphasis, that pathologizing way of looking at differences.
Yeah.
And so, although it's almost incidental to living in any colonized part of the world, at least, that this happens to us, the effort to undo it feels really big, actually. Like that feels really hard. Like, how do I unlearn? I don't know what I don't know. How do I unlearn these things so that I am not constantly subtly communicating, you're not quite right, to these people that I care for or love or provide services to? And so, one of the things we're doing to try and help with that, and I'm so grateful, Kieran, that you are doing this with us, is hosting your brilliant course in the American time zone for the first time and providing online access to the material for 12 months and then extended live Q&A sessions that will also be recorded and available. Tell me, what's your course called and how did it become?
The course is called the Inside of Autism, which is quite ironic because it's not autism training. There's if you want autism training, there is a gazillion different places you can go for autism training. Unfortunately, most of it is not too great, or it's embedded with a lot of the stuff that we've just been talking about, the kind of the ableist narratives and the use of theory as fact and all of those kind of things. So where it came from is I have spent a very long time kind of thinking about and deconstructing a lot of the stuff that goes on around me as an autistic person and around my community as the community of autistic people, and also then the wider autism community, the narratives around parents, and then the narratives around professionals, and thinking about where all this comes from. So what I decided to do one day was literally put it all together in a kind of 6-session course, which starts off looking at the history of autism and the roles of different people and different organizations within the history of autism to kind of, this is the foundation of why we think the way we do today. And this is where it's come from. And I think that in order, anybody that supports autistic people in any way needs to understand that narrative and needs to be able to deconstruct it, because most of that baked in kind of ableism comes from that historical kind of point. So the first session's that, and then the second session I thought, where do I need to go from there? well, normally you would think, well, let's talk about what autism is. And I thought, no, I'm going to be autistic. I'm going to do the opposite. So I talk about what autism isn't. So I talk about the many co-occurring conditions, and there are many, and I will go through all of them. There are over 75 common co-occurring conditions that go along with being autistic, and many of us have more than a handful of those things going on, if not a lot more. So that's a really good place for people who are kind of maybe thinking about themselves. Am I autistic? And actually it's kind of like, oh, that's me, and that's me, and lots of people tick off those kind of things. And then I move on to things like communication, sensory experiences, behavior. I do a singular session on masking and burnout and mental health. And then right at the very end, there's this whole narrative arc that takes us up to autistic identity and the importance of it, and how we can validate autistic identity, and why we need to validate autistic identity and reframe everything. So the whole course is a reframing of the autism narrative, but from an autistic perspective. And it's not just my perspective. I platform myself gratefully on the voices of lots of autistic academics, lots of other autistic advocates who have been talking about this. The whole community, autistic community, have been talking about many of these things for the past 3, 4, 5 decades, and have been ignored for a very long time. So I felt it was time that the professional world, that parents were given the opportunity to kind of to see this unravel in front of them, and actually see how messed up things are, and how that being messed up contributes to the enormous rates of suicide amongst the autistic community, the poor life experiences and outcomes of autistic people, and all of the barriers that are thrown up in front of us. But if we took them away, we would have a lot of happy people.
Brilliant.
Sorry,
You
I've
made
just
me think about
word vomited a lot at you there.
someone who got diagnosed in later life, and the psychologist commented that one of the reasons that they were missed in earlier life was because they were a happy autistic.
Ouch.
Because all of the criteria is
It's framed around the sad autism. Yeah.
So I loved everything that you just said, and I wanted to be devil's advocate a bit and say, so you've written a course about high functioning autism and autistics.
No.
I know you've been accused of that before, and you know where I stand, but
yeah,
how do you
exactly
respond to people who are like, well, it's not relevant for my child, they've got motor apraxia and they're non-speaking, and you know, what do you know about that?
So I know lots about that. But this isn't a course just about high functioning autistic people. We'll deconstruct. I do deconstruct that term in the course itself. This isn't a course about autistic people. This is a course about the autism narrative. So this is deconstructing that narrative, and that's relevant to autistic people who can speak, autistic people who can't speak. That's relevant to autistic people with different co-occurring disabilities. There we have all sorts of people coming on the course. We have parents, we have autistic people, professionals, a mix of those things as well, autistic and non-autistic. And it's a course that's really useful for anyone who wants to understand how to support their children, themselves, their colleagues, their clients in the best way and the most human way as possible. So, so the relevance is there for everybody. It's not just about people who can speak. And now, even from the perspective of looking at me, there's someone who very clearly, from this short snippet that you see of me, is hyperverbal and is able to speak in a very cohesive and way. If you take me out of this context, I speak very little outside of talking about autism. So, and actually speaking is very difficult for me, and it's actually quite painful for me sometimes as well. So, and it's exhausting. So, so although I don't have the experience of being motor apraxic, that doesn't mean that I can't talk to the community of non-speakers who are motor apraxic, and also bring their experiences into that training as well, and help, because again, this is about deconstructing narratives. It's not about talking about my experience is the experience of autism for everyone. That's not what this course is about. It's not about me. It's about the narratives around us as a community.
And I know you have non-speaking consultants and teachers that you work with and have
Yeah.
learned from.
Mhm.
And you're also really good at talking about Tottenham Hotspur, unless it's been a really bad game. But I just, just throwing that out there. Um, okay, I mean, I think that's really clear as to why, what the goal of the course is, what you're trying to do, and why it was built the way that it was built. Um, so I mean, if there are OTs watching this, I would encourage you to, well, sign up for the course yourselves as the health professionals, so because that narrative is woven through the education process and curriculums, and then also just really be encouraging all your families who have who either self-identify or have been diagnosed autistic, to sign up and have this important conversation sort of with Kieran. But really it's one of those things, I think, where you start learning about this and then you start really seeing it.
Yeah.
And it's
I,
quite
I, I
profound.
talk at the beginning of the course about opening doorways,
Okay.
and my role is to present information and to help people recognize that there maybe are new tools that they didn't know existed. And that once you open that door, it's really hard to close it again because it's there. And I have so many professionals that come to me from various different fields that are like, okay, like I can't unsee what you've shown me now, so I have to change things in certain ways, and that can be frustrating for lots of professionals and very difficult. It's a very, very difficult process. I do have to put that content
Unlearning's
warning in.
really hard.
Yeah, unlearning is sitting in the most uncomfortable way because it forces you to reflect on your practice. And lots of people can get really defensive around that because it's kind of, there's a threat. It's a threat. This is new information, or it's information that you feel like you should have known but didn't know. And then that makes you think, what have I done in the past that maybe has
Oh yeah, I
unwittingly
hate that
harmed
feeling.
people? And
Yeah.
all professionals working with autistic people should be going through that process anyway, but many unfortunately don't until it's presented to them. So this is what I'm doing. This is a journey where I love to handhold people through that process so that they come out the other side, not with lots of self-blame and lots of guilt, but actually the strength to work through the processing of that guilt and go to a more constructive place. And I'm fundamentally, I think, as any professional, as a professional myself, I need to be uncomfortable all the time because when I'm uncomfortable, I'm learning. So having one foot in our discomfort, but also having one foot in curiosity as well, helps us stay in motion. It helps us keep moving forward and keep learning. But sometimes when we're sitting with that discomfort, we don't like it. So we turn to the things that keep us comfortable, which means doing the same things over and over and over again and never actually moving forward. There's been a whole shift in the autism narrative in the last 5 years, and the last 3 years particularly, and that's come from the academic narrative really, which has shifted because of the amount of co-production that's coming through, autistic researchers coming through. There's so much more participatory work and collaboration going on, which has meant that the academic narrative has become more informed. So the cutting edge
A corner
research.
of it, yeah.
Say that again, sorry.
A corner of it.
A corner of it, yeah. There has been a shift. There's lots of people clinging on to the old
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
And the old stuff's important because we still have stuff to learn from it, but we have to keep moving forward as well. We can't keep going around in circles because we know the impact that it's had has mostly been non-productive, and it's mostly the life outcomes of autistic people are particularly terrible, in terms of the statistics and the data around that. So
Yeah.
we need a shift around that, and that shift has started. So if you are a professional and you want to be working at the front of your field and making real positive and constructive change for people, then this is exactly the course for you. If you're someone who doesn't want to change and doesn't like change and wants to resist, this can still be the course for you, because actually, who doesn't want more tools in their toolbox? And who doesn't want to be able to kind of to meet people's needs in a humanizing way and validate their experiences and help them have happier and more healthier lives? That should be the goal for all of us.
It's a threshold concept what you're talking about. So it's when you can understand the implicit messaging that is currently prevalent in our culture and the damage that it does, that is such a profound understanding that you develop that you don't look back. You
Yeah.
can't unlearn that
Yeah.
particular piece. So it's like it's a threshold concept because it changes you in so many ways. Well, hey, what do we do if people can't afford the $99 to register?
We have bursary places as well, so people can get in touch. You can get in touch if you have financial difficulties, from a professional point, or from a family point, or as an autistic person, because all are welcome. You can get in touch, and we'll facilitate a discount, even free places, depending on your situation.
Cool. Thank you again for bringing this to
You're
from
welcome.
one Brit to another. Thanks for bringing this to America. It's a bit weird, but I'm just going to say anyway. All right. And thanks for your time today. Is there anything else you want to add?
I don't know. Just that one of the things that's really important to me is community learning. So that mix of professionals and parents and autistic people, and the various combinations of those things within that, when that learning goes along, when all those people come together and learn together, then you're not only learning from me, you're learning from each other as well. And that's such an important part of everything that I do. It's at the heart of everything that I do. That community learning is so much more important than me sitting and waffling at you for an hour and a half, so the Q&A aspect of it, so much goes on in terms of learning in that Q&A. It goes on in the chat, it goes on in the questions and answers. The questions and answers spark more questions and answers.
Right.
And when you've got people looking at the same things but from multiple different perspectives, actually that just encourages amazing thinking and amazing change and amazing connections. And so the Q&A aspects of what we're offering is as important as the actual training itself, because the training is just a leader. The training is just here's the doors, we'll open them for you and you can do what you want with that.
Yeah.
But the Q&A is where the real work kind of happens, and the real learning kind of happens.
Yeah, I totally see that. I love it. I love how reflective you are, Kieran, and I love how so much of what you do is other people's cutting edge, and you do it naturally. And here's this autistic man showing us how to be human and connected to one another in a really cool way. And I appreciate that so much. So thank you very much.
I'm just going to slide under my
I
desk
know,
now.
I said nice things. I can insult you now if you'd prefer. Okay, well, thank you very much. I look forward to
You're
speaking
more
to
than
you again
welcome.
soon. And
The course is available through the Star website, isn't it? We'll
that
have
is a
the
very
links
good
up. And
point, because
that is,
as I just stare at my screen and have no idea how to finish this Facebook Live. Yes, so if you go to sensoryhealth.org and then on our drop-down menu, go to education, and you will see this event in the, I think, community learning to the far right, the Inside of Autism course. So you can also go to sensoryhealth.org/basic/inside-of-autism, which is a bit long. I'll post it in the comments.
that's a good
All
idea.
right. Okay. Thanks so much. Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon, Virginia. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.